By the late summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe had entered a strange phase. The outcome no longer felt uncertain. Germany was not winning time anymore. It was losing control. Entire divisions were retreating faster than headquarters could track them. Rail networks were collapsing. Fuel depots were captured intact. Cities fell without siege. The German state was no longer deciding how the war would end. Events were deciding it for them. On Allied maps, arrows kept extending eastward, faster than anyone had planned. This was supposed to be the safest moment of the war, the moment modern warfare worked exactly as advertised. No desperate counteroffensives, no miracle weapons, no reversals waiting in the shadows. Just momentum. And no Allied commander embodied that momentum more completely than George S. Patton. Patton's armies didn't advance in neat phases. They surged. Columns moved day and night, often reaching objectives before staff officers finished revising timetables. Roads intelligence officers believed were contested turned out to be empty. German rear areas dissolved as American armor appeared where resistance had not yet been organized. Every mile Patton gained did something subtle and dangerous. It shortened the future. Speed did not just defeat German units. It denied Germany the ability to manage its own collapse. There was no time to negotiate surrender, no time to reposition authority, no time to shape the political conditions of defeat. Administrative control collapsed alongside military resistance. From a purely operational standpoint, Patton was doing everything right. Speed reduced casualties. Speed denied recovery. Speed compressed the war. That was the logic every professional soldier understood. But speed also did something else, something far less visible on battlefield reports. It forced decisions before the alliance was ready to make them. At the highest levels of Allied command, the war was already being reorganized into its aftermath. Occupation zones had been discussed, administrative boundaries outlined, political understandings reached long before armies ever moved this fast. Those agreements assumed time for diplomacy to keep pace with operations. Patton removed that buffer. His advances didn't just threaten German forces. They threatened the timetable of history. Each rapid breakthrough narrowed the space between battlefield reality and post-war consequence. Every unexpected success raised uncomfortable questions. Who would occupy what? Who would administer where? Who would stand inside Germany's political heart when the war ended? These were not theoretical questions. In war, territory equals authority. Authority shapes outcomes, and outcomes harden faster than intentions. Yet none of this felt urgent at first. There were no alarms, no emergency meetings, no visible cost for moving fast. Casualties were falling. Resistance was thinning. Victory felt inevitable. That was the problem. Inevitability disguises consequence. For frontline commanders, the picture looked clean. The enemy was beaten. Momentum favored the Allies. Advancing faster only made sense. What they could not see was that momentum had crossed a threshold. It had stopped being purely military. Patton's speed was now colliding with constraints that did not announce themselves with gunfire. They lived above the battlefield, in agreements signed months earlier, in assumptions never tested against rapid collapse. This was not a clash of egos. It was a clash of clocks. The battlefield clock said press forward. The political clock said slow down. Patton obeyed the first. The alliance depended on the second. As long as the war moved slowly, those clocks stayed aligned. Patton broke that alignment. His columns were not just outrunning German forces. They were outrunning consensus. And consensus mattered more than tanks when the war ended. The danger was never that Patton was reckless. The danger was that he was effective in a way the alliance could not absorb safely. Speed forced clarity. Clarity forced decisions. And decisions, once made, cannot be reversed without cost. At the time, no one believed Patton was the threat. He was seen as an instrument, brilliant, aggressive, controllable. What they failed to see was that speed does not ask permission. Once unleashed, it dictates terms. The real question forming beneath the surface was not whether Germany would fall. That was already decided. The question was, who would be standing where when it did? Patton's advances were collapsing that distance faster than diplomacy could adapt. Lines meant to be theoretical were becoming permanent realities. Each pause not taken locked in consequences. Each mile gained removed options. This is why Patton's speed frightened allies more than enemies. German commanders feared momentum tactically. Allied leaders feared what it would decide politically. Stopping Patton was never about saving Germany. It was about controlling the ending. And that is what makes this moment deceptive. There was no battle that forced restraint, no supply collapse, no enemy action demanding delay. The decision to slow Patton emerged not from necessity, but from fear of what success would decide. At the time, it felt like prudence. In hindsight, it was a turning point. The war did not end when Patton slowed down, but the shape of the peace began to harden. What followed was not a battlefield failure. It was a victory managed carefully enough to ensure some outcomes were never tested. And once speed becomes a threat, not to the enemy, but to control, history has already chosen a side. In August 1944, the Allied command structure was operating under a dangerous assumption: that success reduced risk. From Normandy to the Seine, German resistance collapsed faster than planners predicted. Entire formations disintegrated once cut off. Supply depots were captured intact. French cities opened their streets without prolonged fighting. To many commanders, the war no longer looked volatile. It looked solved. Advances were measured in days, not weeks. Casualties declined as momentum increased. Enemy command structures degraded visibly, predictably, permanently. There was no evidence of a new defensive line forming ahead. What existed instead was space. Open roads. Abandoned positions. German units retreating faster than orders could follow them. From a staff perspective, this was the ideal outcome. Combined arms doctrine was working exactly as designed. Breakthrough created exploitation. Exploitation destroyed cohesion. Speed replaced attrition. And speed rewarded confidence. Patton's Third Army became the clearest expression of that confidence. His forces moved faster not by ignoring logistics, but because resistance had collapsed enough to make planning assumptions irrelevant. Fuel shortages existed only because Patton consumed fuel faster than planners believed possible. Bridges were taken intact. The enemy had no time to sabotage infrastructure. Success reinforced itself. Every unopposed mile validated the belief that faster movement meant less danger. That belief was wrong. The absence of resistance did not mean the absence of consequence. It meant consequence was moving elsewhere. As Patton advanced, success began outpacing structure. Political arrangements written for a slower war were being overtaken. Boundaries discussed months earlier were being reached in weeks. And diplomacy does not sprint. The battlefield looked safe. The future was becoming rigid. Patton did not invent speed in warfare, but he understood it better than most. To Patton, speed was not movement. It was disruption. Speed denied the enemy time to think, time to regroup, time to choose. And decisions made under pressure are usually bad decisions. Patton's doctrine was built on forcing those moments, relentlessly. This was not recklessness. It was calculation. Every rapid advance shattered German command rhythm. Orders arrived too late. Reserves were committed against threats that no longer existed. German commanders fought yesterday's war while Patton fought tomorrow's. Speed turned strength into absence. This success compounded. The faster Patton moved, the thinner resistance became. German formations were defeated not by destruction, but by irrelevance. That made Patton difficult to manage. He outran supply forecasts. He crossed objectives before permissions arrived. He reached decision points before politics could react. From Patton's view, this was proof of effectiveness. From above, it was a control problem. Coalition warfare depends on predictability. Patton destroyed predictability. And once leadership reacts instead of plans, control begins to slip. By late 1944, the war had already been divided. On paper. Occupation zones were outlined. Administrative authority discussed. Spheres of influence implied. These agreements assumed time. They assumed gradual advance. They assumed diplomacy would keep pace. They did not assume collapse. Patton's advance forced these assumptions into conflict with reality. Each phase line crossed early made agreements look arbitrary. This created tension, quiet tension at the highest levels. No one wanted to renegotiate while the war continued. Unity mattered too much. So the constraint remained unspoken. Patton was never told he was moving too fast politically. He was told about fuel, about coordination. These were real issues and mechanisms of control. The alliance tried to slow outcomes without admitting why. Patton believed obstacles were logistical. His superiors knew they were strategic. Neither side spoke the full truth. And when clocks misalign, pressure accumulates silently until restraint is no longer optional. Momentum is celebrated in war. It feels decisive. It feels safe. But momentum has a cost when it outpaces control. By September 1944, Patton's Third Army had advanced farther, faster than any Allied formation in Europe. The speed was undeniable. So was the strain. Fuel consumption exceeded forecasts by enormous margins. Supply depots struggled to catch up. Railheads lagged behind advancing armor. On paper, this looked like logistics failure. In reality, it was success happening too quickly. Patton did not slow because resistance increased. He slowed because the system around him was never designed for continuous collapse. Every additional mile forward forced decisions upward. Who would occupy what? Which army would administer liberated territory? Where would post-war authority actually rest? These were not battlefield questions. They were political ones. Momentum removed ambiguity, and ambiguity had been useful. As long as the war moved slowly, leaders could postpone answers. Patton's advance collapsed that delay. Success became destabilizing. And when success destabilizes systems, systems respond by limiting it. Patton was never officially reprimanded for moving too fast. There was no directive that said, slow down politically. That would have required honesty. Instead, restraint came indirectly. Fuel allocations tightened. Priority shifted elsewhere. Coordination requirements multiplied. Each measure was reasonable in isolation. Together, they created drag. Patton interpreted this as friction, the inevitable cost of fast operations. What he did not see was intent. High Command faced a dilemma. Stopping Patton openly would acknowledge the political fear beneath the decision. Letting him continue risked reshaping the post-war map unintentionally. So leadership chose the third option: manage speed without naming it. This preserved unity. It preserved diplomacy. And it preserved appearances. But it also introduced mistrust. Patton felt constrained without explanation. He believed the war rewarded initiative. He had proof. What he encountered instead was a ceiling he could not see. Momentum no longer guaranteed permission. And that was new. The illusion shattered quietly. There was no single order, no dramatic confrontation, just limits. By late 1944, Patton's operational freedom narrowed. Objectives arrived with qualifiers. Approvals slowed. Momentum encountered resistance from above. This was not a rejection of Patton's success. It was fear of what unchecked success implied. Speed no longer looked purely military. It looked political. Each advance forced alignment with agreements written for another pace of war. This is where speed lost its immunity. What once solved problems now created them. Patton continued to push, but the system no longer moved with him. And when systems resist instead of support, even the fastest force slows. The danger was not that Patton would fail. The danger was that he would succeed in ways no one had planned for. That was when speed stopped being an asset and became something that had to be managed. Speed does one dangerous thing. It forces answers. As Patton's advance compressed time, it compressed ambiguity with it. The war was no longer moving toward a vague ending. It was racing toward a moment when armies would stop, and whatever ground they occupied would become permanent. This was the question no one wanted to answer too early. Who would control Germany? Who would administer cities? Who would shape the peace? As long as the war dragged on, these could remain theoretical. Patton made them immediate. Every mile his armor advanced was a political claim, whether anyone admitted it or not. This is why speed frightened allies more than enemies. The Germans saw momentum as collapse. The Allies saw it as commitment. Commitment to borders. Commitment to authority. Commitment to outcomes that diplomacy had not yet finalized. Patton was not trying to redraw Europe, but Europe was being redrawn behind him. This was the quiet danger. Not reckless ambition, but irreversible consequence. There was never a visible barrier, no wall, no checkpoint, just a line that Patton was not meant to cross. This line did not exist on maps used by tank commanders. It existed in conference rooms, in agreements signed months earlier, in understandings that assumed the war would slow down before it ended. Patton never received a document explaining this boundary. He felt it instead, in delayed approvals, in redirected supplies, in priorities quietly reassigned. Momentum did not vanish. It was absorbed. The system learned how to slow him without confronting him. This preserved the alliance. It preserved diplomacy. But it also created silence, the most dangerous condition for a commander who believes in action. Patton was not defeated. He was constrained. And constraint is harder to fight than an enemy. The war ended, but not cleanly. Germany surrendered. The guns fell silent, and the lines where armies stood became borders. Patton's speed had helped destroy the German army, but it did not determine the peace. That distinction mattered. The fastest commander of the war did not shape its conclusion. Instead, Europe froze along positions chosen not by movement, but by restraint. Victory belonged to the alliance. Control belonged to agreements. Patton had proven what speed could do. He had also revealed what speed could not override. War rewards momentum. Peace rewards caution. And those two truths collided, quietly, decisively, at the end of World War II. History remembers victories. It rarely remembers restraints. Patton is remembered as aggressive, uncontrolled, dangerous. But the record shows something subtler. His speed did not threaten defeat. It threatened certainty. The alliance did not stop Patton because he was wrong. They slowed him because he was right too early. Wars end when armies stop fighting. Worlds are shaped by where they stop moving. Patton proved that momentum could collapse an enemy state. He also proved something more unsettling: that speed, once unleashed, forces decisions institutions are rarely ready to make. This is why Patton's speed scared allies more than enemies. Not because it risked failure, but because it risked shaping the future before anyone had agreed what that future should be. The war was won. The peace was managed. And somewhere between those two moments, speed stopped being an advantage and became a liability history still struggles to admit.